In my high school years, I used to be the typical popular kid who organized big parties at home. The truth is that I always liked the nightlife, party, music, friends, drinks. That's something I probably inherited or learned from my parents, who also have a very active social life, and that must be why they allowed my brother and me to do this kind of things at home whenever we could. This time I was in my last year of high school, and to say goodbye to this stage with a flourish, I decided to organize a massive party at my house. My parents were on a business trip, so my older brother and I had the house to ourselves. I invited almost all my friends from the salon, while my brother invited a bunch of college buddies as well. This didn't matter much to me after all. He would also let me bring my friends over when he had his college parties. Plus, if I was lucky, I might pick up some college girl that night. The night of the party, my brother, who was 21, bought enough alcohol at a nearby liquor store to get a circus of elephants drunk. Meanwhile, I took care of the food. Junk, obviously. Bought tons of cheesy nachos, fries, and greasy fried chicken for the guests too, and moved the furniture around to make room for the guests to dance. Fortunately, our house is quite big. In fact, I've always thought my parents bought it precisely thinking about having parties because it was just perfect for it. The first person to arrive was one of my friends who I hired as a DJ on short notice. I helped him set up his equipment and choose the music just in time before the rest of the guests started arriving. I recognized some of them and had no idea who the others were. I just assumed they were people my brother knew or friends of his friends who wanted to join me. Everything went smoothly for a while. People were drinking, dancing, and playing beer pong at the dining room table, drinking beer on tap, raiding the snack table. In short, everything you'd expect from a full-blown party. I chatted with several girls during the evening, although the music was extremely loud and most seemed more interested in having a good time than talking to me. That is, until I met this girl who was drinking beer alone in a corner, who seemed to be more alone than she should be on a night like this. She was a short blonde who was wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, and who I thought I recognized from school, but I wasn't quite sure. Seeing no harm in trying, I approached her and struck up a conversation. "Hey, how are you? Enjoying the party so far?" The girl looked up from her glass of beer and smiled shyly. "Yeah, I'm having fun," she said, though the tone of her voice didn't sound very convincing. "Nachos are great." Hearing that, I took the opportunity to extend the conversation, so I said, "I'm glad to hear that, you know, I made them myself." I don't remember what he said next, but one thing led to another, and soon we were both immersed in a very pleasant chat. The truth is that she was quiet and shy at first, but little by little she opened up, and so far everything was on the upswing. So after a few more glasses of beer and God knows how many snacks, I learned that her name was Angela, and that she was one of the cheerleaders on the school soccer team. That she was alone at the party because she had just broken up with her boyfriend, a jock on the soccer team who was too possessive of her, and that this was the first time she'd been out to a party since they broke up. Wow, not bad for less than an hour after seeing her alone in the corner for the first time. Truth be told, I was hoping to meet someone new at the party, and apparently this wish was coming true. Angela was very pretty, nice, chatty, and I was having a really good time with her. And at that moment, I said something to her that I will never forget. "You know what? I have a really good feeling about tonight." About halfway through the party, we were sitting next to each other on the couch kissing, and just as my earlier words affirmed, I thought it would be a lucky night. After all, I probably would have asked him to come upstairs with me to my room if we hadn't been interrupted. While Angela and I were busily exploring each other's mouths on the couch, I felt a hand grab me firmly by the shoulder, and with a jerk, I was pulled away from Angela. Obviously, I turned to find out who the party pooper was. That's when I came face to face with a huge African-American jock. about 100 pounds more muscle than me, and looking at me with the most angry eyes I've ever seen in my life. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my girlfriend?" he barked in my face. I immediately realized who it was, and what Angela said next confirmed it. "What the hell, Fred? We're not dating anymore." The ex-boyfriend turned his gaze back to her and said, "You don't get to decide that." "Hey man, stop it," I said, and sure enough I sounded as threatening as a squirrel squealing at a grizzly bear. "You two aren't together anymore. She can do whatever she wants." In case you're wondering, yes, I was intimidated, but there was no way I was going to show it in front of the girl I liked. At that moment, I could see a huge vein swell in Fred's forehead just before he stood up and pulled back his fist to punch me. I tensed my face in anticipation of the impact, but none ever came. "What do you think you're doing to my brother?" echoed my brother's voice throughout the house. All eyes turned to look at my brother walking briskly through the crowd of guests who parted to make way for him. Suddenly, all attention was on him, who had his eyes fixed on Fred, who, in turn, was still holding me by the shoulder with a firm, sweaty grip. "Let go of my brother right now and get out of my house," I said to him in a low, threatening voice. "Get the hell out right now." There was a moment of silence. Fred was a big guy, but so was my brother, and not only that, but he was also on the varsity wrestling team, so you could tell this was going to be an even fight. Once he realized that my brother was in no mood to deal with his nonsense, Fred let me go and walked out the door without another word. People cheered towards my brother for kicking this guy out, for not calling him by the adjective he deserves. Once the tense moment was over, everyone at the party continued drinking and dancing like it was nothing. Upon seeing Angela, my brother winked at me and went off to catch his own fish. While I couldn't intimidate Fred in the slightest, it seemed that simply facing him was enough to impress Angela. I won't go into details, but about half an hour later, it was just the two of us in my room having a good time. Leaving aside the little debacle with Fred, everything was shaping up to be a perfect night, until a loud bang from downstairs caused us to interrupt what we were doing. At first I thought someone had dropped it, or something heavy like a keg of beer. Then another explosion was heard, which caused the music to stop dead in its tracks and was replaced by the screams of terror from a bunch of people. "What's happening?" asked Angela with a lot of fear in her eyes. "I don't know. You stay here, I'll go check it out." I quickly pulled on my jeans and ran out of my room, and when I came downstairs, my heart stopped for a couple of seconds at what I saw. Everyone at the party was crouched down or hiding under furniture. Meanwhile, the friend I had hired to be the DJ was lying face down on the floor, lying in a huge pool of blood gushing from a small hole right in the middle of his eyes, which were staring into nothingness, completely lifeless. I was paralyzed. As I lay completely motionless at the foot of the stairs trying to process the situation, I heard, "Nick, get down!" My brother's voice snapped me out of my frozen, terrified state, and I turned to look at him just in time to hear another loud gunshot and see him fall to the floor unconscious as a pile of blood began to pour from his chest. I was immediately horrified by what I saw and screamed his name very loudly. I wanted to run to where he was, but a series of pops forced me to the ground with my hands covering my ears. The shots continued to ring out for at least the next 15 to 20 minutes. They were constant, but slow, and every time a shot rang out, someone inside the house was either wounded or killed. Meanwhile, one of the bullets ricocheted off the wall and grazed my ear, but I restrained myself from screaming so as not to reveal my position. I lay there on the floor and watched my brother slowly bleed to death helplessly, not knowing if he was still alive or if it was too late for him. However, after what seemed like an eternity, police sirens finally started to be heard. I couldn't see what happened, but I could hear the shooting outside, as the shooter fought the police with what little ammunition he had left for the next 10 minutes. Finally, I heard the loud blast of a shotgun followed by a loud bang. The police flooded the house shortly after to treat the wounded, and as soon as they entered, I ran to my brother's body and started screaming for a paramedic to come and check him out. My face was covered in blood at the time from the bullet scratching my ear, but I told the paramedic who came to treat me that I was perfectly fine, while I begged her to attend to my brother, who was lying completely limp in a pool of blood. She approached him and began to check his vital signs, and as she placed her fingers on the right side of his neck, she stared at me and said a couple of words that I will never forget. "He's alive." At this moment, I really knew the meaning of the phrase, "My soul came back to my body." That was just what I felt, as if my breath came back to me. However, the paramedic said that I had lost a lot of blood, so I had to be treated immediately, and so it was. In an instant, another group of paramedics came in and moved my brother on a stretcher to the ambulance, while I was able to get out with my own feet to be treated for my small wound. As I walked to the ambulance beside my brother, I could see the body of the shooter lying motionless on the garden ground. It was Fred. His cold, dead hands still clutched the hunting rifle he had used to shoot us. A shotgun blast had pierced his abdomen and scattered his foul remains across my yard. All I could think of when I saw him was that hopefully he had suffered enough pain before he finally died. Fortunately, my brother was able to make a full recovery, but that took years, and in the early days, he came very close to not making it. I also fully recovered from my ear injury, although it turned out to be not just a scratch but almost half an ear torn off. So I later underwent a little cosmetic surgery in order to mitigate a bit how strange I looked with one less ear. My mutilated ear, however, I couldn't care less. I am alive, as is my brother, while 14 of our party guests viciously lost their lives at the hands of a jerk so narcissistic he couldn't stand a girl leaving him. And speaking of her, the truth is we never saw each other again after that night, but I'm also glad she got rid of that wretch. I always say that my college days were very cliché. I used to live the wild lifestyle of most 20-somethings in college, i.e. parties almost every weekend or any day off from class, furtive affairs with any random girl, usually as drunk as me, water and tomato juice to relieve the hangover, and the infallible dark glasses to hide it. Anyway, yes, it was definitely a very stupid way to live. But at that stage of my life, all I wanted was to have a good time and try to enjoy myself to the fullest. The dangers I foolishly exposed myself to and the possible consequences of excesses were things I couldn't care less about in life, things I didn't even stop to think about. I am definitely over this part of my life, and the story that I'm going to tell you now had a lot to do with my decision to stay away from parties and all this harmful environment, that the only thing it did was to damage me physically and psychologically, especially psychologically. It all started on the night I was invited to a house party. This party was no big deal. I mean, it was just another party. A new Saturday night, lots of people planning to drink too much and crash unconscious on the host's floor. People I won't mention doing illegal activities. People who weren't invited wanting to crash. In short, that environment I was so adapted to and went out looking for every weekend like a hungry animal. I actually knew the host, but I wasn't really friends with him, but more like sort of acquaintances, because he was like a friend of a friend, you know, plus someone I had coincided with in more than one party, although it's probably important to keep in mind that when I say host, I only mean the person who rents or owns the house where we are going to celebrate the party, because in reality, there was always a group of crazy guys who would be the ones who would provide everything we needed. That is, drinks, snacks, glasses, plates, and everything that was necessary. so the host basically just lent the place. When I arrived at the house the night of the party, it really looked like it was going to be an amazing time. A group of my friends were already there, the music was amazing, the ambiance was perfect, and I was ready to let loose and enjoy the party as long as my body could take it. I walked in, and just as I walked through the door, I immediately met the host. We'll call him Lucas for the story, and I walked in to shake his hand, to thank him for letting us use his house and tell him how wonderful it was. I started with a "Hello, brother. How are you doing?" I just tried to keep it casual, and he literally just stood there looking at me with a blank stare. After a few moments where I held out my hand and he just looked at me like there was something on my face for an incredibly awkward moment, I just took my hand away and asked him if he was okay. He kept the same dead look and just shook his head slightly, saying, "No, Dick, I'm not okay," then turned to walk away and went upstairs. I was obviously very confused. This was an incredibly strange interaction that I definitely did not anticipate from Lucas. The few times we met, he always seemed pretty laid back, and I thought we were decent with each other to the point that he would accept my conversation. But this really caught me off guard. I was really taken aback. After thinking about it for a few moments, I ignored the whole thing and just went back to the table to get something to eat and have a second drink, and I thought maybe he was just in a bad mood or something, and I wasn't going to let that ruin my night. After a while, I was having a good time at the party and chatting with people I knew. I asked a few others if they had talked to Lucas or seen him that night, and they all had some interaction with him, mentioned that he treated them with the same coolness, but said they just assumed he was reconsidering the idea of hosting the party. I agreed that was probably the case, but the flip side is that he simply might not have agreed to host. In the end, I figured this was going to be one of those parties where the host complained a lot afterwards, and where no one was allowed to get down on the floor. We'd had some killjoy hosts before, and it was fine. It was their house after all, but it was still a bit of a pain. Well, I thought that was the case until what happened, and only then did I understand everything. This was about 2 hours after the party started. Everyone was relaxed enough, probably too relaxed. We were all having a good time and enjoying the night. Just as we expected, the music was amazing and the atmosphere couldn't be better. But suddenly we heard what sounded like someone screaming at the top of their lungs from a closed room in the hallway. It was incoherent at first, but after a few minutes, I reached over to press the pause button on the stereo to mute the music and see what the hell was going on. But as soon as I did, the door to the room opened, and out came Lucas. He looked seriously angry, more like furious, with a scowl and an angry expression on his face, as if he was about to beat the crap out of someone. As he slowly walked down the hallway to the main area, everyone would have passed him wherever he went, mainly because I don't think any of us wanted to be the person he took his anger out on. Then he stopped in the center of the room and everyone surrounded him. At that point, all eyes were on him. That's when he asked, "Who the hell turned off the music?" The whole crowd looked around, but slowly all eyes were falling on me, basically pointing at me. Seeing me ratted out, I just sheepishly said, "Oh yeah, I did. We heard you scream, and we wanted to make sure you were okay, man." I finished this sentence, and as soon as the last words were out of my mouth, I saw Lucas raise his hand towards me, and I found the tip of his gun pointed at my face. At that moment, I could feel my heart beating frantically. People in the room started screaming and trying to back away and hide, but no one really did anything to help the situation. Not that I expected anyone to jump in front of a gun for me, but a little solidarity wouldn't have hurt. I slightly raised my hands and tried to tell him that I was sorry for turning off the music, that I didn't want any trouble, and that if he wanted me to, I would just leave the party and not come back. I was basically trying to beg for my life at that moment, because this guy really looked like he was about to shoot me, and being honest, I braced myself for it. At that instant, all that was going through my mind was, that's it. This is how I'm going to die, killed by a demented man in the middle of a party and drunk. But after several more seconds of silence where he seemed frozen looking at me as if he was actually looking through me into nothingness, he moved his arm and put the gun to his own head. At the same time, he started laughing in a creepy way. It was almost cartoonish, like something the Joker would do. The whole room stood mute as they watched this guy laugh, and then he pulled the trigger, but instead of a thunderous gunshot, there was a click. The bullet didn't come out. Either the gun was empty or it had malfunctioned, we didn't know. But there was a huge collective sigh of relief when that happened. It wasn't over yet, though. He pulled the trigger against his head one more time, but there was no shot either. And as soon as it became clear that the gun wasn't loaded, he started laughing like an absolute psychopath. Obviously, these types of situations were big party killers. We were all speechless and in complete shock, watching Lucas laugh like an absolute psycho in the middle of the room. He seemed to think this was the funniest thing that had ever happened. And honestly, I think the whole room was ready to beat the crap out of this madman while he just laughed out loud and scoffed at how he had fooled us all. At that moment, everyone was looking at him with faces that were somewhere between bewilderment and anger. Well, of course we all thought he was going to do it. I mean, yeah, dude, you had a gun in your hand. And rule 1 when it comes to firearms is to assume it's always loaded and that the person holding it intends to use it. Not to mention you were acting weird and angry all night, and everyone in the room was a little drunk when you decided to put it to your head and pull the trigger without even saying a word. What the hell did this idiot have in his head? Immediately, everyone started to leave the house, including my group of friends and I. We had definitely had enough of that party. As we walked out, he just laughed and asked why we were all leaving, called us fools, and said we had to learn to take a joke. In my opinion, faking suicide is not a joke, and threatening someone else with a gun, loaded or not, is not a joke. Nothing he did was funny, and I was very scared for my life at the time he did it. So as I walked out and kept hearing him mock what I had done, I went back in and said these same things to his face. Then he kept laughing and said, "Dude, you should have seen your face." At that instant, he put the gun back on his head and said to me with a chuckle, "Easy, man. It was just a joke. Look, it's not car." Bang. Lucas did not manage to finish the sentence because at the moment he was telling me this, he put the gun on his head and pulled the trigger again. His intention was to show once again that the gun was not loaded, but instead a bullet came out and went through his head. I was completely paralyzed and in a state of absolute panic as I looked at Lucas's body lying on the floor, forming a pool of blood around him, and I could feel the hot liquid splashing on my face. As I lay motionless, trying to control the trembling of my legs, I could hear a chorus of screams all around me, and then a stampede coming towards the house. Lucas died instantly when he accidentally shot himself. For some reason, there was still a bullet in the gun, and the fact that it didn't come out the first 2 times he pulled the trigger was pure chance. After this, the police arrived at the house, took Lucas's body away, and began questioning everyone. However, it was soon established that it had been an accident, and that no one but himself was responsible for what happened to him. But to be honest, I feel supremely guilty, because probably if I hadn't gone back to complain to him about what he had done, he wouldn't have put that gun to his head a 3rd time. Maybe I would have gone back to the room and put it in a drawer and none of this would have happened. Or maybe it would have. We'll never know anyway. I must tell you that this was the last party I attended. Since then, I never wanted to know anything about parties again. This situation left me with deep psychological wounds. I could not count the number of times I had nightmares about that moment, and to this day I have a bit of a phobia of parties. From then on, I was only able to attend the occasional get-together with friends, but nothing more than that. If you are one of those silly people who like to make these kinds of jokes, I hope this story will help you understand that your life is not a joke, and that a moment of recklessness can cause a tragedy. My name is Emma, and the story I'm about to tell you happened when I was in my first semester at the University of Vermont, and I warn you beforehand that it is something very sensitive that includes sexual violence and could be too uncomfortable or disturbing for some people, so if you are someone sensitive to this kind of topics, I recommend you to omit the story or treat it with discretion. At the time, like most incoming students, I didn't know anyone. There were a lot of people entering the school year, so I made the decision without my parents knowing to join a sorority, and coincidentally, my roommate, who I will call Liz, also decided to do the same. Liz was an out-of-state student just like me, so she was just as desperate to find some friends, and that's how we both ended up running for the same sorority. For those who are not familiar with the subject, to enter a sorority, you must first go through a sort of admission process in which they put you through several tests or challenges, many of which I can't even talk about. But basically, these challenges are geared towards making the applicant able to prove her loyalty to the sorority. However, in my case, after just 2 days into the process, I decided to give up, even though I had already paid almost $50 to apply, or rush as this process is also called. And the reason is that I just didn't feel comfortable with the direction these challenges were going. So, in my opinion, joining a sorority really didn't live up to expectations. My friend Liz, on the other hand, was able to overcome the challenges, and before she knew it, she was only 1 day away from being accepted into a sorority. In all honesty, I didn't know how she put up with all those bullshit challenges, but I still congratulated her. I couldn't understand how she decided to go through with the stupid challenges, but it was her decision and I respected it. One Friday, she came to the dorm after returning from her classes, eager to start the weekend, and told me that the next day, which would be Saturday, would mark the end of her rush challenge and she would finally be accepted into the sorority. I was happy for my friend, but I couldn't help but think about the challenge she had to do to finally be accepted into the group. When I asked her about the last challenge, all she could do was laugh, but in a way it was almost like a nervous laugh. And I noticed that when I asked her the question, her facial expression changed a little, which let me know that she just wanted to ignore that question, so I didn't push any further and left her alone. It was Friday night, and we both finished our classes, so we decided to kill some time by going to get some food and then going off campus to see if there were any parties going on. Unfortunately, most of the parties going on during that time were pretty dead, which is unusual for college on a Friday night. At the time, most people told me that the school was known for having a pretty good party scene, so we were pretty bummed to find out that there weren't really any good parties going on at home. Disappointed and tired, we both decided to call it a night and headed back to the dorms. When we arrived, Liz had asked me if I could do her a favor. She started talking to me about the sorority chapter and the last challenge she had to complete, and in regards to that, she asked if I could join her for the next day's event. To be very honest, I didn't know how to feel about it, since I didn't complete all the challenges, and I was afraid that the sorority council wouldn't even like me being there since I wasn't part of their group. But Liz assured me that it wouldn't be a problem, and that I could perfectly well accompany her. At the time, I still had no idea what was going on, but I took her word for it and told her I would do it. Liz was completely thrilled that I agreed to go with her, and with that we both went to bed. I woke up the next morning and the first thing I could think of was the sorority event. Even though I gave Liz my word that I would attend with her, I was still a little nervous, mainly because I knew that sororities and fraternities treat these admissions events as very seriously, and if you are not part of their group, they look at you differently. Anyway, I spent the first half of my day doing what I had to do for school, and for the next few hours I worked on a bunch of homework and ran a few errands before I had to go to this blissful event. But before I could even realize it, Liz and I were getting ready at the last minute. As I was about to change into jeans and a t-shirt, Liz told me that the event was actually formal, so we had to dress for the occasion. After about 30 minutes of trying to find the best clothes for the Magno event, we finally left the dorms and headed toward the place where the ceremony would take place. After walking a few minutes off campus, I quickly realized that this event was just another house party. As we walked up the steps to the front door, I could hear the music through the walls, and we didn't even have to knock because there were already two men standing at the front entrance who must have known that Liz was part of the sorority because they let us both in with no problem. As soon as we walked in, I was immediately shocked to realize that this event was not just for the sorority. From the looks of it, it was a mix between a sorority and a fraternity. To be honest, I wanted to leave from the very moment I walked in, simply because the place was too crowded and the music was too loud. I wanted to tell Liz that I was ready to leave anytime she was too, but I wasn't even 10 minutes into walking through the door when I lost her in the crowd and couldn't find her. I assumed she was catching up with some friends or she went to talk to the sisters. That's what the sorority members call each other. But the thing is, I didn't see Liz again for quite a while. As the party progressed, I ran into some familiar faces, so I decided to catch up and try to hang out, although the volume of the music didn't allow for much. While I was not a member of the sorority, I was surprised that I was still treated the same way. As the night went on, I spent most of the time having casual conversations with some of the people, which made me think that maybe I had been a little prejudiced at first, because the truth was that I was having a nice time. The only problem was that I still couldn't find Liz. At one point in the evening, I was talking to one of the older sorority sisters, and as we were chatting amongst ourselves, two of the brothers approached us and offered us some drinks. I declined the offer immediately, knowing that I should not take drinks from anyone I did not know. They quickly left, and I continued my conversation with the sorority sister. And as we continued to talk very pleasantly, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was Liz. I finally found her again. I motioned for her to come. Then she approached me and told me that she had been talking to some sisters and apologized for not coming earlier. I told her that there was no problem. Then she told me that she would go to say goodbye to the group of sisters she was talking to a moment ago, and would come to share with me and the girl I was talking to. However, almost an hour passed and she had not returned. I didn't give it much importance. I thought that maybe she was having a good time. And honestly, I was having a good time too. It turned out that the sorority sisters were much more interesting and cool than I imagined, but judging by the stupid challenges they put you to enter, I honestly thought that they were a bunch of brainless girls. With the pardon of that expression, because I know it sounds derogatory, but honestly, it was what I thought before dealing with them that night. Another hour passed, and Liz still didn't come back, and I had been watching the group I was talking to first for a while, and I realized that she hadn't been with them for quite a while. However, as I was looking for her in the crowd with my eyes, something caught my attention on the stairs. It was Liz. She was walking up the stairs with a group of people, but I couldn't really tell if they were all with her. I could tell she looked a little drunk and some guys seemed to be helping her. This was the first time I had seen her since she told me she would be here in a moment, and it was almost 2 hours ago. At that moment, I started to go up the stairs in search of her, but as I was walking, I ran into an old classmate from my high school. She took me by the arm, and we started to have a little chat. I was so excited to be reunited with this friend that for a moment I completely forgot about Liz. I just wanted to see that she was okay. But honestly, I didn't have any bad thoughts about it, so I relaxed talking to my friend. About 20 or 30 minutes passed, and that's when I remembered I was going to take a look at Liz. I peeked back up the stairs, but she wasn't there anymore. Then I looked around to see if I could see her among the group of friends I was with earlier. I quickly found them, but she wasn't with them. The next few minutes I was trying to locate her among the group of people, but she was nowhere to be seen. It was then when I apologized to my friend and told her to allow me a few minutes to go get my partner. She said no problem, and we arranged to meet when she came back to introduce Liz to her. I started looking for my friend everywhere in the living room, but I couldn't find her. In view of this, I decided to go upstairs to see if I could find her upstairs, but there were only the bedrooms. I started crossing the sea of people to get there anyway, and after a few pushes and shoves, I finally made it to the top of the stairs. I didn't want to call out to her, because she probably wouldn't hear because of the loud music. It was too loud indeed. The hallway that was at the end of the stairs was incredibly dark, but there were some people there. Some were smoking and chatting, while others were couples who were probably taking advantage of the darkness of that hallway to do their thing. But I also saw some who seemed to be consuming other things that were not exactly alcohol. Anyway, I did not like at all the kind of atmosphere that was in that place. I walked all the way down the hallway to the end, noticing that all the doors of the rooms were closed. Surely they were occupied, but I did not find Liz. However, when I was about to go down the stairs again, I could see the door of one of the last rooms open, and two men were coming out of there putting their clothes on. At that moment, I figured they were just a couple of guys. They were laughing and pushing each other in a way that seemed rather friendly, and when they looked up, I realized they were the same two guys who had offered me and my sister drinks earlier. They passed by me, and as they did so, they both looked at me in a way that was somewhere between amused and mischievous. And immediately an alarm went off inside me, because I had just seen these two guys among the group of people who were with Liz on the stairs the last time I heard from her. As I left the room, they closed the door behind them, but something inside me told me that I should look there. So I did. I opened the door to the last room on the right, and in fact, I didn't see anyone, because all the lights were off and it was really very dark. I started to call out loudly to Liz but got no answer, so I pointed my flashlight in various directions in the room, and when I shone it into one of the corners, that's when a wave of panic hit me so hard that for a moment I felt my legs give out, and I swear I was about to pass out. There was Liz curled up on the floor, and in conditions that I'd rather not describe, but which I assure you caused me a great shock. I immediately ran to where my friend was, and it was only then that I could hear that she was crying uncontrollably, because previously I could not hear anything over the music. When I shined the light of my flashlight on her, I didn't even need to ask her. It was obvious that the worst had happened. I can't even describe how I felt, but the biggest feeling that came over me, besides the concern and indignation for what had been done to her, was the immense guilt that burned me just remembering that I could have avoided it if I had continued on my way to the stairs when I saw her with that group of people. My first thought was to call an ambulance, but she begged me not to. I told her I needed medical help, but she refused. She told me we would do it when we left. All I could do was just give her a hug and tell her I was there to help her. I stayed in the room with Liz for about 1 hour or so, while she recovered emotionally and physically. I helped her wash her face, and fortunately there was a shower in that room, so she was able to take a bath. That wouldn't erase what happened, but at least it would make her feel a little better. When we got back to the bedrooms, Liz was still in shock. She just got into bed all at once. I urged her to go to the police, but she refused as well. She did not want to get medical help at the time, however. Fortunately, she did a few days later. All I can say is that physically she was able to recover 100%, but the psychological wounds of living through an experience like that are definitely not erased from one moment to the next. So after a while, Liz finally agreed to go to therapy, and only after that she dared to denounce her aggressors. Liz is a strong and brave girl who managed to overcome many things. It has been more than 10 years since this terrible event. We both graduated from college and remain friends to this day. Fortunately, due to the complaint of Liz and 5 other girls who suffered the same abuse by this pair of ruffians, both were sentenced to many years in prison. Liz, meanwhile, is now happily married to a wonderful man with whom she has a beautiful little girl. She is an outstanding professional, and in general has a good life, so justice was finally served. It was a Saturday night and my friends and I were too bored. Our week of college exams had just ended, and we all needed something to do to take our minds off what our grades might be. That night we were all playing video games at my house when one of my friends, Will, got a notification from his phone. Someone he was following on Twitter had just posted an ad for a party at a house fairly close to where we were. When I asked Will who the host was, he simply shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "She looked cute, so I followed her like, I don't know, the month. I didn't really pay much attention to it," he said. This response came as no surprise to any of us. Will had a known weakness for pretty faces. Still, we thought his raging hormones might finally have been somewhat useful for the first time. That night, we were all so bored. The idea of a house party seemed like the kind of out-of-control fun we needed at the time to ease our college exam anxiety. So we all went to get ready to go out. And before we left, I grabbed my emergency inhaler from my room. I don't go anywhere without it, as I have chronic asthma, and I had to carry an inhaler with me at all times. As I was saying, I kept my inhaler in my pocket and joined my friends on a carpool to the blissful party. On the way, we decided that I would be the designated driver of the group. First of all, I wasn't really into alcohol. I just liked hanging out with my friends and maybe chatting with some girls if the opportunity presented itself. I've really always been a bit reluctant to consume any kind of substance that would make me lose control, so I'm not a fan of alcohol, let alone drugs. I drove for about an hour, and Will, who had been giving me directions, finally ordered me to stop the car. I parked the car near a gigantic house that stood alone at the end of the neighborhood street. We were all very surprised and even a little confused. We didn't know if Will had misinterpreted the GPS instructions on his cell phone and had brought us to the wrong place, knowing him. That wouldn't surprise us at all, but no, it seems that the instructions were correct, and that was just the place where the party would take place. According to the Twitter post, seeing what the house actually looked like worried us a bit at first. Sure, it was a huge place. In fact, it would be a perfect place to host a house party. However, from the outside, it seemed eerily quiet. Not a single ray of light peeked through its closed red curtains, and we couldn't hear any of the usual noises you hear at a party, like drunken laughter or loud music. Nothing. Everything was dead silent. Not even the crickets accompanied the silence of the night. Nothing but the sound of the wind through the leaves of the trees and the sound of our footsteps on the grass. For a moment, we worried that we had been tricked, because after checking several times, it was clear that Will had not lost us. However, we checked again. After corroborating for the 1,000th time that if it was the address posted on the Twitter ad, we came to the conclusion that we were at the right address, and also that the party was probably a prank. Perhaps the poster wanted to annoy the homeowner by advertising a party at his house, or maybe they were simply trying to waste the time of anyone who wanted to attend the fictitious party. Whatever the case, we were ready to leave and go get pizza or something. We would have done just that if Will hadn't insisted on knocking on the door first. We knew it was a bad idea, but my friends and I also knew that Will would never be done insisting if we refused. So we followed him to the front door of the house to see if anyone was inside. As we reached the front door, I noticed a faint metallic smell lingering in the air, like copper that had rusted, that immediately caught my attention, but I tried not to make a big deal out of it. Will knocked 3 times on the large double doors and waited for a response. We heard no noise coming from inside, but the door opened only a few seconds later. In an instant, our eyes were bombarded by a series of flashing multicolored lights, followed by loud, blaring electronic music. The metallic smell from earlier gave way to a more familiar odor of cheap alcohol, pizza, and cigarettes. We were greeted at the door by the girl who announced the house party on Twitter, in an outfit that left very little to the imagination. She greeted us with a broad smile and escorted us inside. Behind the closed curtains of the house, There was a party like any other I had ever attended. He told us to make ourselves at home and handed us all red glasses filled to the brim with alcohol. But since I had a responsibility to get my drunken friends home safely, I left mine on a table nearby. Will let out an "I told you so" look before running off after some girls. For a while, everything was great. My friends were having fun drinking and eating junk food to the max. Meanwhile, I was talking to people and doing what I love most about these parties, meeting new people, and I was having a great time. While I noticed that the curtains always remained closed, I never thought to question it. As the night progressed, I noticed that the metallic smell from earlier returned. I didn't mind it too much. It wasn't a pleasant smell, but I've smelled much worse at other parties. I could tell that there were a lot of old decorations in the house, and among them a couple of bronze statuettes. So it occurred to me that that might be where that smell was coming from. Or maybe I just assumed that someone must have had a nosebleed or forgotten their tampons or something. Well, if you've ever had a chance to compare the two smells, you'd realize that they're pretty similar. At some point, I began to feel my asthma starting to bother me, probably because I was exerting so much effort in dancing. However, it was nothing that a puff of my inhaler couldn't fix. So I quickly shook out my inhaler, put it in my mouth, and squeezed out its contents. My eyes were closed as I inhaled the chemical cocktail. I counted to 10, as I had done a million times before, and exhaled the breath. The stiffness in my chest eased almost immediately as the medicine took effect. I opened my eyes again with plans to continue partying, but instead, I was met with a completely different landscape than before. As soon as I opened my eyes, I was confronted with a nightmarishly fleshy landscape. I was no longer standing in the middle of a house party, and if so, it was a house straight out of hell. I'm going to describe exactly what I saw at that moment to give you a mental picture. The walls were made of pulsing red flesh that expanded and contracted in unison, as if the house itself was breathing. The floors were carpeted with a layer of pink, warty muscle that squished under my feet like a tongue. Where there used to be a door, there were 2 rows of vertical teeth that were tightly bound together. However, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that there were people in the house. The partygoers were dancing and drinking to music, which was really just the sound of the house breathing in and out. They all looked half-digested, and many of them were missing huge chunks of flesh from their face and torso, exposing white bones and empty holes where their organs were supposed to be. It was as if acid had eaten them from the inside out. None of them seemed to realize that most of their bodies were missing. They continued to dance to the sound of the living, breathing house on its carpet of flesh, as chunks of their own flesh fell off. Hundreds of long, flabby tubes that looked like large intestines hung from the organic ceiling like vines. The partygoers, oblivious to it all, grabbed the tubes and held them up to their mouths to drink the green, acidic bile that the house pumped through them. In their minds, they must have been drinking beer in red glasses, unaware that they were digesting themselves to be eaten by the house. The faint metallic copper scent that I perceived when I first arrived here had now become overpowering since I learned the true shape of this house. If I had to venture a conclusion, the source of that copper scent must be the same one that makes everyone hallucinate that they were at a normal house party. Whatever chemicals were in my inhaler must have counteracted the effects of the hallucinogens in the house. That was the first thing that came to my mind. The worst part was that there were no doors or windows in that place. The only way in or out was through the teeth that were grinding where the door should have been. I tried to open it, but found it difficult to hold the teeth because of the slippery saliva covering them. After a while, my vision was blurring. The hallucinogens kicked in, and suddenly I was transported back to a normal house party where people were having fun and all was right with the world. I had to take another puff from my inhaler to return to the horrible reality, and each time I did, those moments of brutal clarity were shorter and shorter. I was stuck there for hours trying to find a way out, but to no avail. Desperate because there was almost nothing left in my inhaler, I started banging my teeth very hard and started yelling at the guests so they could wake up from the sleep the house had them submerged in, among them my friends, who were dancing and drinking with their half-eaten bodies, being digested by the house and without realizing it. Suddenly I noticed that they began to look at me, and I felt that my heart was going to stop when they all began to walk towards me. I ran as fast as I could and kept banging on the door as I felt my shirt and arms being pulled, and I started punching and kicking because all these half-eaten zombies wanted to make the house eat me too. But even though I fought with all my might, I knew it was in vain. I had taken the last puff on my inhaler and was starting to feel my lungs closing up as I slowly returned to the illusion of the house. It was the end. The house had eaten me and my friends. Feeling that I was taking my last breath before the chemicals in my inhaler wore off, I looked around me for the last time, knowing that that horrifying scene would be the last thing I would see in my life. The image of that carnivorous house and the bodies of my friends half devoured by it. At that moment, I closed my eyes tightly and prepared to die. The next time I opened them, I was in a hospital ward with a steady, rhythmic beeping piercing my ears, an oxygen mask on, and my arms connected to a bunch of hose pipes. Maybe the house couldn't eat me after all, or maybe this was my next step into hell. Those were my immediate thoughts. A second later, a nurse came into the room. She seemed very surprised to see me, and immediately gave me a smile that for some reason seemed very enthusiastic. Then she ran out of the room, and a moment later returned with a doctor, and behind them were my parents. I was confused and shocked at that moment. I didn't understand anything, but I was happy to see my parents again. That afternoon, the doctor talked to me and told me that I had suffered some sort of chemical poisoning, apparently caused by the chemicals in my inhaler mixing with other chemicals in the environment. The doctor and my parents told me that I was very lucky to be alive, and this thanks to the fact that my friends realized that something was wrong with me at one point and tried to help me. But as they told him later, I started running around the house like crazy, shouting incoherently. Supposedly, I was repeating like crazy that the house was alive and wanted to eat us. Then I started banging on the door, which made me start hyperventilating until I finally lost consciousness. After that, the guys immediately put me in the car and took me to the nearest hospital, and it was right there that I woke up. It seems that the house was not from hell after all, but that I had begun to suffer hallucinations due to intoxication. However, I could never figure out what that chemical was that was in the environment, and when mixed with those in my inhaler, caused me to almost die. The moral of the story is that we should not always trust what our eyes see, because they can easily deceive us.